and welcome to this edition of A Conversation With. I'm Jim Marshall of the New Bedford Cable Network, and today in studio we have Professor Doug Roscoe, political science professor, and more stuff teaching too, but I'm just going to use that as a title right now, at UMass Dartmouth. Thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.
Just wanted to talk. I mean, we've had a new president in office for 100 days. It's a little past now, but we talk about the first 100 days and sort of where we stand and how things are going and what have you. But first, thanks for coming in. I know it's the end of the year for you and you just want to finish your grading. And,
I just submitted grades this weekend, so that's off my plate.
And get out and enjoy summer. Are you teaching in the summer?
I don't teach on campus. I do teach in the online program occasionally. I am teaching an online class this summer, but it's the time when I get research projects done, prep new courses for the fall, and so forth. So and come and talk to people like you about
this
politics.
Is great. Before I get to that too, talk to me a little bit about the political science program. I wanted you to promote the program at UMass Dartmouth. Lots going on there and a lot of opportunities going on there.
Yeah. The political science major is one of the largest in the College of Arts and Sciences. We have a pre-law concentration that's really popular. Over half our majors are pre-law concentration, so we have a lot of students who go on to law school. But we have a sort of a general concentration. We have an international politics concentration. So students do lots of things when they graduate. They go to the State Department. They go work in nonprofits. And we also have a public administration degree that the political science department houses. So a lot of those students go on, work in town government, work in state government. It's a good sort of career-focused job track.
Do you find students interested in government and, for lack of a word, current events and political science? Do you see that?
I really do, and I think there was a period of time where we sort of thought about, like college students were sort of tuned out of politics. I think the internet has really made them more aware of things, and for a certain set of students, there's some who are still tuned out, but a lot of our students are just really into the news. They know what's going on. They're super up on current events, have really strong opinions. So there's a big group that are really, really into politics. So it's encouraging.
Has it changed from your standpoint, politics, political science, when you're talking to these kids? I mean, 40 years ago, and when I was in college, and I hate to say it that way, but I mean, just the advent of social media has changed. It seems to have changed everything, because I don't know if there's any vetting. I don't know if there's any, what you're reading is accurate, really, for lack of a better word, compared to, it used to be you had the three networks, you had the newspapers, you had radio, and it was pretty consolidated.
Right.
Now it's all over the place.
Yeah, I've just had this conversation with my students quite a bit this last semester in my classes, because it's difficult to even talk about what the media is. We don't have the language anymore, So if one of your friends posts a story from the New York Times and it shows up in your Instagram feed or Facebook feed or whatever, and you click on it and you read it, did you get it through social media or did you get it from a newspaper? And so I think thinking about like what the sort of source is for the information is probably the most important piece. But also I think there's what we talked about is like push and seek. Do you seek out information? Do you go to the New York Times website and read all the stories that are posted, or do you just wait for it to be pushed to you through the algorithms of the social media? And I think that makes a big difference. The students who go out and seek, and then they seek information from sources that are good, tend to be much more informed. And there are still a lot of people who do that.
And I think part of the issue, too, that I see is that people sort of, because news is sort of filtered now, you can get news with whatever slant you want to see or hear. Not that it's inaccurate, but it's what's being pushed to them, and that's what they'll gravitate to. Which is, you like to think that people are open to everything, but and again, not to say that media outlets are inaccurate, but they are only pushing a certain agenda, if you will.
There are some that are inaccurate, but most are not. Most are not giving you false information or fake news. It's just news with a perspective.
Correct. Right. Exactly. It's news with a perspective instead of just news.
Yeah, and in some ways, that's not really all that new. If we go back to the beginning of American history, the early press in the U.S. was partisan press. They were published by the political parties. So it was perspectivized news. It was news for you if you were a Federalist or a Democrat. And so in some ways, it's a return to that. The idea that media would be this business and try to appeal to everybody and get as many readers or viewers as possible was sort of a new thing in the American history. So in some sense, we're kind of returning to that idea. People like news from perspective. It makes them feel comfortable. So I'm not surprised that's where the market has gone.
Talk to us a little. So, we've had 100 days of the second Trump administration, and I'm sure there's been a lot of talk in your class from students and what have you, and hopefully a lot of different perspectives being talked about as well. I think that's healthy to have people on all sides.
Yeah.
Your overall impression from your standpoint and your profession, what have you seen from the first 100 days or so?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to, when you're sort of talking about the Trump administration, sort of differentiate between things that they're doing that are sort of conservative policy goals that Republicans and conservatives have long wanted and to various degrees of intensity, and then things that the Trump administration is doing that are sort of norm breaking and boundary breaking and maybe somewhat out of line with the Constitution and the way it's supposed to work. And so for me, whether you agree or not with we need stronger immigration control, or whether we need tax cuts, or whether we want to do something in the Middle East or not, that's different than how you go about implementing those policies.
Correct.
And sort of the aggressive use of executive orders, really pushing the boundaries on that, sort of pushing the court away and sort of threatening not to follow court orders and those sorts of things, denying due process, right? All of those kinds of procedural issues, to me as a political scientist, are much more alarming. We're always going to disagree about immigration and taxes and whatever. That's natural. That's a natural political debate. We should have that debate. Whether you're on the left or right, you should welcome that debate. It's how we get to better policies. But once we start to talk about moving away from what has long been the constitutional order, I think that gets a little bit troubling. And I think that's why a lot of people are most worried about what's going on right now.
Well, yeah, some are, and you could say too that some are thrilled. I mean, this is what some people will say. This is what we wanted. This is why we voted for him.
Yeah.
And again, it's the way the vote happened, I guess.
Yeah.
As you look at the constitutional issues, first of all, talk about executive orders. Roughly, I think it was 147, but he's done a couple more since then. Mm-hmm. So it's over 150 executive orders, which is the most that have taken place. Talk about executive orders and their impact, because you're bypassing Congress now.
Yeah.
But it's not as though all presidents have done it. So it's not as though executive orders or what he's doing is new, but the volume is new.
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, all of the executive orders are done in a way that is, in a sense, technically legal, right? The executive orders are fine as long as they're within the constraints of what law says. And so, Congress passes laws, presidents have signed things into law, and they always give some discretion to the executive branch for implementing them. And so what, presidents are able to do is within those boundaries, engage in some actions that sort of really do set policy in a particular way. But they have to be within the boundaries. But what those boundaries are, how you define them, how you make sure that the president's actions are within those boundaries is not always necessarily clear. So what counts as, say, an emergency under the statutes, mm-hmm. right, is who gets to decide what an emergency is. So a lot of the executive actions that the Trump administration has taken are using definitions like an emergency or an invasion that are part of the law, and saying, yeah, that's what we're under right now, and this gives us the authority to do this executive action. And so who gets to disagree with that? Well, someone raises it as a judicial issue, and then it goes to the courts. So, and someone says, hey, this is not an invasion, you can't do this, your executive order is not in line with law, it's going beyond the law. Well, that has to be adjudicated in the courts. So, and that's what we're seeing, really a pattern. A lot of these executive orders are being litigated right mm-hmm. now, and a lot of them are being paused. So these are these injunctions that the courts are,
or some have stayed too.
Some have stayed. Yes.
Some are stayed. Letting him do it.
That's right.
Until it gets settled.
And some are a little bit more in line with what law permits, and some are a little bit boundary pushing and kind of a little questionable in terms of what they're trying to do. But it takes a while for that to work out through the courts. So one big question is whether the courts say the executive order cannot go into place yet until we figure out whether it's really an emergency or whatever,
Yeah.
or whether it does get to go into place and then has to be overturned or would be potentially overturned. But all these things take time, and there's the judicial process isn't super quick moving. So some of these things are just pending still. Some of them are going into action, and maybe they'll get overturned eventually. But in the interim, they stand and they become law.
His first 100 days, certainly different from his other first 100 days.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the folks were right when they said he knows what he's doing this time versus going in before. Well, he knows what he wants to do.
He knows what he wants to do. There's still a lot of chaos coming from the White House. This is a disordered administration. It was disorder the first term. He doesn't really have a very strong sort of managerial framework that he puts into place in terms of making decisions. Things are a little chaotic. Hiring is a little chaotic. Messaging is a little chaotic. It's not a really well-ordered sort of management that he runs. And that's not really much different. And I think what is different is that a lot of people who had some of those conservative policy goals, right, that who weren't afraid to push the Constitution a little bit to get them kind of prepared for the Trump administration. And a lot of this is in that Project 2025 document. These are the things that we want to do. These are the conservative policy goals, and here's how we can do them. And so he has this playbook. And we're seeing the playbook. A lot of those executive orders, almost the entire language of them was in Project 2025 . And he disavowed it on the campaign trail. He said, I don't know what that is.
I don't know who they are or what it is.
But it's clear, a lot of people that are guiding him and his counselors and advisors are, they do know what's in there, whether he knew it or not, and they're putting executive orders together. He's signing them. So what's happening is we're getting a lot of action very quickly because a lot of that drafting of the language of how you might accomplish those goals was already done.
But in the same token, he's doing what he said he wanted to do or was going to do. Mm-hmm. On the campaign trail, for the most part, he disavowed Project 2025. But that being said, he's talked about what he was going to do, and he's doing it. Mm-hmm. And I think, and people voted for that too. You can argue this is what people want.
I guess the important thing is to sort of go back to the policies versus the, like the ends versus the means of getting there, right? And, I think what came out of the first Trump administration is a feeling of frustration, which is how every single president in the history of the United States has felt when they've tried to accomplish their policy goals. The Constitution creates a process that's difficult to change. It's difficult to change policy.
Because you got three branches of government.
You have three branches of government. You have two parties. You typically lose at least one of the houses that you might control at the midterm. So it's a very difficult process to get major policy changes, and that's by design. Like it or hate it, that's what we have. But a lot of people hate it, and I think Trump came to hate it. He felt like he couldn't accomplish his goals, and I think a lot of people around him felt like they are getting frustrated they couldn't accomplish their goals. And so, one way to do that is just to accumulate more power in the executive, because a single person can then just make it happen. And lots of presidents have kind of wanted to do that, but have felt constrained by the constitutional order. And I don't think he feels constrained in that same way. He's willing to push boundaries. He doesn't really care about the rule of law particularly. If he can get around the rule of law, if he can get around the law, he's willing to do that. And that's very different than a lot of past presidents. These are things Obama could have done. They're things that George W. Bush could have done. But they didn't take those options because they respected that constitutional boundary that the presidency has always had.
Right.
But
it seems as though Congress, though, too, is on board with it. You've got a branch of government that really hasn't done too much since their session has started. I know they're tackling a budget right now, although they can't agree on that right now because the president wants one thing and the hardcore Republicans want another, really.
Right.
But they seem content to let the president do what he wants to do. They're not going to.
That's true. Let's talk about Congress. Because all of these things he's doing through executive orders that are questionable, that are likely to be overturned, and a lot of them are going to probably be overturned, they could all be done through Congress, right? If it passed a new law, change a statute, president signs it, then it's there. It's not questionable anymore, assuming it doesn't violate the Constitution. But the House can pass those things, although it's been challenging for them because they have a bare majority and just a couple of defections on the Republican side, and they can't get something through the House. But it hits the Senate, and the Republican Party doesn't have enough to over.
Because you need the supermajority.
You need the supermajorities. You need 60 votes there. So the Democrats are really able to block anything, and that's again the frustration. So Trump feels like he has this big mandate. And he wants to pass all these policies, but he feels like Congress can't do it for him, so he's got to do it on his own. Now, the other thing about Congress that's interesting is, I think, if you look at who the Republicans were in Trump's first term and who they are now, there's not too many people left in the Republican Party in Congress, but particularly in the House, who were elected before his first term, right? So the older Republicans, right, who sort of were pre-Trump, right, have been replaced by people who have been elected in the age of Trump. And when you get elected as a Republican in the age of Trump, you have to have allegiance to Trump because that's who your voters like. And it's very difficult for a Republican to win a congressional seat, particularly in the House, without being a big supporter of Trump. And if you try to object to anything he does, then there's all kinds of focus on you. You're going to get a primary challenge. It's going to be difficult to get reelected. So the Republicans in the House either are all on board for real, or they may have concerns but feel like they can't really voice them because that's political suicide for them.
What is the reason for his enduring popularity? I mean, I have never seen an elected official with as devout supporters as him. I mean, I look back and I would say that in my lifetime, I think the most popular president that I saw, whether you liked him or not, was Ronald Reagan. I mean, he left office with a 67% approval rating. I think it was about 66, 67. Beloved. And I don't think people were as devout to him as they are to President Trump. So why is he so effective?
Well, let's put it in perspective. There's probably about a third of the population that is never going to question Trump. They're always going to be on board with him, right? That's the kind of MAGA base. And, let's set them aside because they're an interesting group sort of psychologically. But if you look at his approval ratings, they're not much higher than that.
No, they're about 40% right now.
Yeah, right. So there's not a lot of people who aren't part of that core MAGA crowd who think he's doing a good job, right? And so then if you sort of bridge from that 35% to the extra 15% he needed to say win the popular vote in the election, right? You've got that middle group, and they're more interesting to me, right? They voted for Trump. Now maybe they don't like him so much. They're finding things to dislike about him. I think that group, their vote had a lot more to do with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris than it had to do with Donald Trump. They didn't. There was a lot of retrospective voting, I think, that happened in 2024. People thought, the economy's bad, I'm not doing well, inflation, et cetera, et cetera. There was a narrative there about it. Immigration was also a little part of that narrative. And they're like, we can't do another 4 years of that. And so we'll give Trump another turn, right? So that's a little bit what was going on with those people. That core 35%, he really could shoot somebody, on the streets of New York City, and they would still love him, And so that group, I think, is a different group, and I think, for them, he's a little bit of he's like a Rorschach test, he can be what you want him to be. There's an identity that's tied up into it, a sense of being in an in-group and an in-crowd, and having an identity as part of that group. That's a really strong drive, and I think people who feel that sense of being part of the MAGA movement, it's really powerful for them, and so they can make him to be whatever they want him to be.
It must be fascinating from your standpoint doing teaching for as long as you have, because he is a one and only. I mean, there has been nobody like him.
Yeah, that's true.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah, and not particularly policy driven. Again, he kind of has a set of conservative policies, but he could. I think if he came out tomorrow and said, we should have a huge tax increase, or we need to expand Medicaid or something like that, that 35% of the MAGA crowd would be like, yes, we love that policy. And we know from political science research that a lot of what people's opinions are on policies aren't what make them choose the parties. It's their party identification that helps them to choose their policy preferences, right? And I think for that crowd, that base, that's really strong that way. And wherever Trump wants to lead them, they'll follow. So he has that ability to tariffs, great. They're all on board with tariffs, If he thinks tariffs are horrible, they'll think tariffs are horrible. So
it's curious though, because obviously when I saw the last poll and I was talking off the camera about that, CNN, I mean, his favorability rating is only at 40%, low.
Yeah.
Democrats are only at 32.
Yeah.
So I mean, the other side doesn't seem to interest anybody either, which is curious to me that one doesn't have a message or a leader, and the other one has the leader and I guess a message that, as you said, a third but there's nobody on the other side has a better message than he does, apparently.
Well, let's talk about the Democratic Party. I think there's a couple of issues going on with the Democrats right now. One is sort of a longer standing issue about what they should focus on, and I think that there's a narrative out there that the reason why they lost is because of they're too into woke policies. That's what they're all about. Their branding is about DEI and supporting trans people and so forth, right? I don't think that evidence bears that out. That's the reason why they lost. That they focused too much on that, and Trump had an ad that people thought was really effective that kind of played on that. Mm-hmm. I think that there's some good evidence that wasn't one of the more effective ads. It was more about the economy, largely.
It's always about the economy.
It's always about the economy.
It's always about the economy. Any election.
But a lot of Democrats feel like that was their problem. That's why they lost. They talked too much about the woke agenda, so to speak, right? So we need to get back to what are we going to do economically for people, right? And then I think there's a contingent that sort of says, well, yeah, that's great, but we can't forget that other side of things, right? It's still important to do things to support civil rights and equity and those kinds of things are important goals. We don't want to give those up. That's what defines the party. What's the point of having power if you can't do the things that you want to do? And why can't we be a party for the working class, but also for people who are marginalized by their gender identity or sexual orientation? Those things aren't mutually exclusive.
I mean, both parties have changed.
I
mean, really, they have,
in their bases. But so that's a division. So Democrats are kind of angry with themselves, and you see this with, there was the Seth Moulton it was in the, so there's a debate. So
Congressman Moulton up in the North Shore.
Who really sort of said, we should be able to talk about trans athletes, and then he was attacked from other people in the Democratic Party,
right.
and other people came to his defense, and so that debate and that split within the Democratic Party has been difficult for them. It's not a good look, right, that they have this difference, and so Democrats are kind of angry with themselves. I think the other issue is that people have felt like the Democratic Party hasn't mounted an effective response to Donald Trump. And particularly they look at the congressional leaders. How come they haven't done more? How come they haven't spoken up more? What are they going to do about it? So that's been challenging. And I mean, in some ways, there's not a lot they can do.
I was just going to say, there really isn't. They have the House, they have the Senate. Margins are close, I get it.
That's right.
But they still have the majority.
Yeah. They can filibuster stuff in the Senate, and they will, and that's about all they can really do. And I think as well that I think there's a strategy among the congressional Democrats to let Trump commit a bunch of unforced errors and just stand back and watch. And I think what they understand, and I think this is true, is that Congress won't really ever stand up to Donald Trump until he becomes really unpopular. When his approval rating gets down to that 35% base, and that's it.
Though?
Well, that's a good question. But I think that's what their gamble is. I mean, I think they're thinking, when people see tariffs go into place, and everything on Amazon is 3 times as much money. For a spatula that you used to get for $5 is $15, and your car is 25% more, and that people will dislike him, and I think that they're waiting for that kind of falling off. And then you might even see some Republicans who might be a little bit more willing to stand up from more moderate districts where they've got to win some Democrats to win,
Is he, I don't want to say a one-off, but he is such, and you said it off camera, he's a brand. People, like you said, he's got his I don't want to say followers, that's not the right word, that he's not Christ or whatever, but he has his supporters. But is there somebody after him because I think his media background makes him, I don't want to, he is a showman. He's comfortable with that. A lot of people aren't, but he is. Is there somebody else, or is the party going to have to undergo, the Republican Party, is it going to have to go do some soul searching in the next couple of years, next year really, when you think about it?
I think it's a good question. I think there's a couple of wings out there. I think he's already sort of suggested, like J.D. Vance, might be the guy, for the future, or Marco Rubio. He's kind of put those things out there, and those are two different pathways, by the way, Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance, right? And I think they'll compete along with. I think Vivek Ramaswamy has a whole different brand of conservatism that would kind of be in the mix for winning the next nomination for presidency. But I think J.D. Vance shares Trump's willingness to push the boundaries of the constitutional order in order to accomplish conservative goals. So he would govern a lot like Trump would, I think. I think Marco Rubio is more of a traditionalist. I think he would be more inclined to kind of bring back the traditional role for the president. I think Vivek is also probably more like, Vivek Ramaswamy is more like Rubio in that sense. So they would govern differently, I think, and there's going to be a good question for the Republicans, but none of them have that sort of charisma that Trump has.
He's got charisma.
And I think that's a big change, and I think, and where that comes into play is what your Republicans are willing to say to the president that they aren't willing to say now, right? As I talked about, right? If you're a Republican in the House, you can't go on TV and say, well, I don't know about these tariffs. These are horrible. This is a bad idea, because then you're in trouble with your voters. But if it's J.D. Vance putting the tariffs in place, you could probably criticize them and your voters aren't going to care too much, right? Because nobody, at least at this point, is going to command that respect from the base, that MAGA base that Trump does. So it's going to free up the Republicans to be a little bit more of an independent actor within the party and within the constitutional system.
You got it about 30 seconds. What do Democrats do? Because they seem, at least Republicans have that person. Democrats don't really have a leader right now.
Yeah, they don't. And I think that, I think they need to focus on the midterm, recruit good candidates, raise a bunch of money, make sure that you win the House back for sure, And I think that's what they're focused on. They're really kind of playing a ground game. But I think the long-term game for the Democrats is that, the Democratic Party is always focused on creating Democratic voters. I think they need to think about creating Democrats, And that's one thing that Trump has been able to do, right, is he has a brand, right, that has legs, and the Democratic Party needs to put something out there and define itself in a way that attracts people who maybe they were independent or something, or maybe they were Republicans, kind of conservative, but they don't like the Trump brand. How do they become Democrats? And that's the big issue for the next, say, 10 years that the Democrats have to think about.
That's going to do it. We have flown through time. We'll have to get you on again because there's certainly a lot to talk about. Professor Doug Roscoe, thanks for coming in.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
That's going to do it for this edition of A Conversation With. I'm Jim Marshall, the New Bedford Cable Network. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you again soon.
I don't think that many kids in my son's school even do it.
No way.
No way.
No way.
No way, my kid would never vape.
Get your head out of the cloud. Talk to your kid about vaping. Visit talkaboutvaping.org.
Visit aarp.org/caregiving for information on how to provide even better care for the person who wants to care of you.